I have spent the last 4 months telling you exactly what was going to happen in the Persian Gulf. I told you in June that the ceasefire between Israel and Iran was not a peace deal, it was a reload window. I told you in August that the Strait of Hormuz was going to become the pressure point of the second Trump administration. Not Taiwan, not Ukraine, not the South China Sea. I told you in September that when you saw a second carrier strike group repositioned east of Suez, you were no longer looking at deterrence, you were looking at preparation. Every one of those calls is now on public record, and you can go back and check the dates yourself. Today I am going to make one more prediction, and I want you to understand from the very first minute that this one is different. This one is not about whether something happens. It is about the fact that the machinery has already been switched on, and the people who switched it on have quietly removed the off button. What you are watching in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not a deployment. It is not a show of force. It is not a message. It is the opening move of a maritime enforcement architecture that Iran cannot survive in its current form. And I am going to show you exactly what has been put in place, why the timing is not accidental, and why the Islamic Republic is now facing a choice that has no good answer on either side. I am Professor Jiang Shuin. On this channel we do not do panic and we do not do cheerleading. We follow the logic of power. We follow the incentives. We follow the geography. We follow the money. I do not care what CNN is telling you tonight. I do not care what Fox is telling you tonight. I do not care what the BBC headline says, or what the anchors on Al Jazeera are speculating about. Headlines are written for the next 24 hours. I am here to show you the next 24 months. And I will be honest with you, what the logic is telling me right now about the Strait of Hormuz is the most structurally alarming conclusion I have reached about the Persian Gulf in the entire time I have been analyzing this region. Not because a war is imminent, although it might be, but because for the first time since 1988, the United States has stopped playing the game of freedom of navigation and started building something that looks a great deal more like maritime dominance by permanent presence. And Iran has no answer to it. That is the thesis. Let me now show you the board. Let me start with the geography, because you need to see the whole board before I show you the trigger. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and the actual navigable shipping lanes inside that strait are only about 10 kilometers across, split into a 2-mile wide inbound lane and a 2-mile wide outbound lane, separated by a 2-mile buffer. Every single day, somewhere between 20 and 21 million barrels of crude oil and condensate move through that corridor. That is roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and about a third of all seaborne oil trade on the planet. It is also the exit route for about 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas, most of it from Qatar. On the north side of that strait sits Iran, with a coastline of roughly 2,400 kilometers along the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, dotted with islands that Tehran has spent 40 years fortifying, including Abu Musa, Greater Tumb, Lesser Tumb, Keshem, Larak, and Suri. On the south side sits Oman, and behind Oman sits the entire architecture of American Gulf presence, which is not one base but a system. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters at Naval Support Activity Bahrain, home to roughly 9,000 personnel and the operational command for CENTCOM's maritime component. The United Arab Emirates hosts Jebel Ali, the largest U.S. Navy port of call outside the continental United States, and Al Dhafra Air Base, which currently has F-35S, F-22S, and reconnaissance aircraft rotating through it. Qatar hosts Al Udeid, the largest American airbase in the Middle East, with roughly 10,000 personnel and the forward headquarters of Air Forces Central. Kuwait hosts Camp Arifjan and Ali Al Salem. Saudi Arabia now hosts a rotational American air presence at Prince Sultan Air Base that was quietly re-expanded in 2019 and never scaled back. And now, in the last several weeks, on top of this already dense architecture, the United States has stacked something new, and this is where you need to pay close attention. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group and the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group have overlapping operational windows in the CENTCOM area of responsibility for the first time in years. That is not one carrier. That is 2 carriers, plus their air wings of roughly 75 aircraft each, plus their escorts, which include Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system and the SM-3, SM-6, and Standard Missile-2 interceptor family. Underneath the water, at least 1, and almost certainly 2 Ohio-class guided missile submarines are in the region, each carrying up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Add to that the amphibious Ready Group with a Marine Expeditionary Unit on board, and add to that the recent deployment of A-10s and additional F-16 squadrons to bases in the Gulf. And you are looking at a concentration of American naval and air power in the Persian Gulf that we have not seen since the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And unlike 2003, this force is not oriented toward a land campaign. It is oriented outward, toward the water, toward the strait, toward the Iranian coast. Now here is the central mechanism, and I want you to hold this phrase in your head for the rest of the video, because everything else flows from it. What the United States is building in the Persian Gulf right now is what I am going to call the dual choke point lock. It is not one operation. It is two synchronized enforcement architectures running in parallel. The first choke point is the strait itself, where American surface combatants, in coordination with Combined Task Force 152 and Combined Task Force 153, are conducting persistent presence patrols with rules of engagement that have quietly shifted from reactive to preemptive. The second choke point is the sanctions enforcement architecture, which the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control and the U.S. Navy are now running as a joint kinetic financial operation, boarding tankers suspected of carrying sanctioned Iranian crude, seizing cargoes, and in some cases diverting entire vessels to friendly ports where the oil is offloaded and sold, with the proceeds routed into a Justice Department fund. The dual choke point lock means Iran cannot move oil out and cannot move weapons in without one of these two enforcement layers catching it. And once you understand that this is the architecture, everything else that has happened in the last 90 days stops looking random and starts looking like a sequence. Let me walk you through that sequence step by step, because the causal chain matters. Step 1. In the aftermath of the June strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, the Islamic Republic's air defenses were significantly degraded. Independent assessments from IISS and open-source analysts have documented that Iran lost a substantial portion of its long-range S-300 systems and much of its domestically produced Bavar 373 coverage over key sites. That means the airspace over Iran, and critically the airspace over the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, is now more permissive to American and Israeli air operations than at any point since the S-300 deliveries began in 2016. Step 2. With that air defense degradation as the backdrop, the United States moved a second carrier into the region in the late summer, and rather than rotating it out after the standard 60 to 90-day window, extended its deployment and overlapped it with the arrival of the Ford. That overlap is not administrative. That overlap is deliberate signaling that the U.S. can now conduct two simultaneous strike packages from two different vectors without depleting its reserve. Step 3. In parallel, the Treasury Department expanded its designations under Executive Order 13902 and the Iran-related provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act to include an additional set of shadow fleet tankers, ship-to-ship transfer operators in the Gulf of Oman, and a network of Emirati, Malaysian, and Hong Kong front companies that had been laundering Iranian crude as Malaysian or Omani blend. Roughly 130 vessels are now on the SDN list, and insurance markets in London and Singapore have responded by refusing coverage to any vessel that is called at an Iranian port in the last 12 months. Step 4. The Fifth Fleet, working with allied navies under combined maritime forces, has increased the tempo of vessel boardings under the authority of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and domestic sanctions law. In the last 3 months, publicly reported boardings and seizures have roughly doubled compared to the same period in the prior year, and the cargoes being seized are no longer small. We are talking about full VLCCs, very large crude carriers, holding 2 million barrels each. Step 5. And this is where the architecture snaps shut. With Iranian oil exports harder to move, with insurance premiums for any tanker touching Iranian waters climbing above prohibitive thresholds, and with Chinese teapot refineries in Shandong quietly reducing their intake because Beijing does not want a secondary sanctions fight during a fragile trade negotiation with Washington, Iran's foreign currency inflows are compressing at exactly the moment its domestic economy is under maximum strain. The rial has lost significant value against the dollar in the parallel market this year. Inflation on food staples is running well above official figures. And the regime's ability to fund its regional proxy network, which was already damaged by the degradation of Hezbollah, the fall of the Assad government in Syria, and the attritional losses of the Houthis, is being squeezed from a second direction. Now let me take each of the key actors and explain to you why they are locked into this trajectory, because this is where mainstream analysis consistently fails. Let me start with the United States. The mainstream frames the American posture in the Gulf as either reckless escalation driven by a hawkish administration or as routine deterrence that has been happening for decades. Both framings miss the deeper calculation, what Washington has recognized, and what has driven this shift under both the late Biden National Security Team and the current Trump administration, is that the 20-year window of American strategic distraction in Iraq and Afghanistan allowed Iran to build a regional deterrent architecture, the so-called axis of resistance, that made direct pressure on Tehran too costly. That architecture is now broken. Hezbollah's senior command was decimated in 2024. Syria under Assad is gone. Hamas as a governing entity in Gaza no longer exists. The Houthis remain, but they are increasingly isolated and dependent on a supply line that runs through waters the U.S. Navy now dominates. In other words, for the first time since 1979, Iran is strategically naked, and the American planning community understands that this window will not stay open forever. Russia is rebuilding its ties to Tehran through the strategic partnership agreement signed earlier this year. China is quietly moving to backfill Iranian oil purchases through more sophisticated laundering. If Washington is going to reset the strategic equation in the Gulf, it has to do it now, in this window, before those workarounds harden. That is the American incentive, and it is structural, not partisan. Now Iran. The mainstream frames Iran as ideologically committed to closing the Strait of Hormuz in the event of pressure, as if this were a reflexive response written into the DNA of the Islamic Republic. That framing is wrong. Iran has never closed the strait, not during the tanker war of the 1980s, not after the assassination of Soleimani, not after the strikes on Fordow. And the reason is simple. Closing the strait would immediately trigger a coalition response that would not just target Iranian naval assets, but would provide the political cover the United States has been quietly seeking for wider strikes on the residual nuclear program and on the leadership infrastructure of the IRGC. Tehran knows this. What Tehran actually does is calibrate harassment, fast boat swarms from Bandar Abbas, limpet mines on individual tankers that can be plausibly denied, seizures of specific vessels linked to Israel or to companies that have angered Tehran. That calibrated harassment worked when the American presence was thin and rotational. It does not work when there are two carrier strike groups, an Ohio-class boat, and an MEU sitting inside the theater. Iran's incentive now is to preserve the appearance of deterrence while quietly avoiding any incident that gives Washington the pretext it is looking for. That is a very difficult needle to thread when your economy is collapsing and your domestic hardliners are demanding a response. Now the Gulf Arab states. The mainstream frames the Saudis and the Emiratis as reluctant allies dragged into an American confrontation they do not want. That framing is out of date. What has changed, and what has changed decisively since October 2023, is that the Gulf monarchies have concluded that Iranian regional influence, mediated through proxies and through the missile and drone program, poses a direct existential risk to Vision 2030, to NEOM, to the UAE's tourism and financial hub strategy, and to the entire post-oil transition of the Gulf economies. You cannot build a global luxury tourism destination 50 kilometers from a country that can drone strike your desalination plants. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have therefore quietly aligned their maritime and intelligence cooperation with Washington to a degree that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The Abraham Accords architecture is expanding, not contracting, and Saudi normalization with Israel, while publicly frozen, is operationally continuing at the intelligence and defense industrial level. Their incentive is to see Iranian capability degraded permanently, and they are willing to provide basing, overflight, and financial support to achieve it, provided the Americans do the visible work. Now China. The mainstream frames Beijing as Iran's strategic backer, prepared to defend Tehran against Western pressure. That framing fundamentally misunderstands the Chinese calculation. China imports roughly half of its crude through the Strait of Hormuz. Chinese refineries have adapted to processing Iranian crude at a discount, but that discount is a convenience, not a necessity. What China cannot tolerate is a closure of the strait or a wider war that disrupts flows from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, which together account for a far larger share of Chinese imports than Iran does. Beijing's incentive, therefore, is to keep the strait open at almost any cost, including quietly reducing its Iranian purchases if that is what it takes to prevent Washington from escalating. That is why you have seen the Shandong teapots pulling back. That is not Chinese abandonment of Iran, but it is Chinese prioritization of the strait over the regime in Tehran. And Iran knows this. That knowledge is one of the loneliest realizations in Tehran right now. Now Russia. The mainstream frames Moscow as Iran's partner in a new axis of authoritarian powers. That framing is more accurate than the China one, but it misses the constraint. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, its Black Sea fleet has been humiliated, and its ability to project power into the Persian Gulf is non-existent. What Russia can do is provide Iran with air defense components, with diplomatic cover at the Security Council, and with technical assistance on the drone program. What Russia cannot do is deter an American operation in the Gulf. Moscow's incentive is to keep Iran distracting the United States, but not to be dragged into a confrontation Russia would lose. That is a very cold incentive from Tehran's point of view. Now, before I go further, I want to present the strongest counter-argument to my thesis, because I owe you the real debate, and you deserve to see exactly how I got here. Here is the steel man for the view that I am overreading the current American posture. The counter-argument goes like this. The United States has surged forces into the Persian Gulf many times before, in 2012 during the last major Iran crisis, in 2019 after the Aramco attacks, in early 2020 after Soleimani, in 2024 after the direct Iranian missile strikes on Israel. Each of those surges was interpreted by analysts at the time as the prelude to a decisive American action. Each of those surges was followed by de-escalation, back-channel diplomacy, and eventual force drawdowns. The pattern of American Gulf deployments is one of demonstrative presence followed by tactical patience, not of strategic transformation. On this view, what we are seeing now is another iteration of that pattern, driven by the specific political needs of the Trump administration to appear tough on Iran while pursuing a grand bargain deal that folds the nuclear file, the missile file, and the regional proxy file into a single negotiation. The Steelman continues by noting that Trump himself has repeatedly expressed skepticism about long wars in the Middle East, that his political base is divided on Iran policy with a significant restrainer faction, that his key negotiators have signaled openness to a renewed deal that would relieve sanctions in exchange for verified nuclear rollback, and that the actual purpose of the two-carrier presence is not to enable strikes, but to give Washington leverage in those negotiations. The Steelman further argues that the sanctions enforcement crackdown, while real, is not new. Boardings and seizures have been happening for years, and the recent uptick is more about maintaining pressure than about permanently strangling Iranian exports, because the Trump administration knows that if oil prices spike above a certain threshold, the political cost at the American gasoline pump will exceed any strategic gain in the Gulf. On this Steelman view, what I am calling the dual chokepoint lock is really just enhanced coercive diplomacy, and the endgame is a deal, not a war, and not a permanent transformation of the Gulf security architecture. That is the strongest version of the counter-argument, and I want to acknowledge that it has real force. Analysts I respect, including some who have been right about the Middle East for a very long time, hold this view. Here is why I nonetheless disagree, and I want to be precise about the disagreement. The 2012 and 2019 surges occurred against an Iranian regional network that was intact. The axis of resistance in those years could credibly threaten multiplication of any American action into a regional war, dragging in Hezbollah, Syria, Iraqi militias, and the Houthis. That deterrent multiplier is now largely gone. What made previous American patience rational was that the cost of action was very high. What has changed in the last 18 months is that the cost of action has fallen dramatically, and when the cost of action falls, the probability of action rises, whether or not any individual policymaker consciously decides to act. Second, the sanctions architecture that is now being layered on top of the naval presence is qualitatively different from prior sanctions regimes. Secondary sanctions on Chinese and Emirati intermediaries, combined with the insurance market response, are producing a squeeze on Iranian exports that is more severe than anything the maximum pressure campaign of the first Trump term achieved, and it is happening faster. Third, and this is the point that I think the Steelman does not adequately address, the two-carrier overlap combined with the Ohio-class presence and the sustained air posture is not calibrated for negotiation leverage. It is calibrated for options. The distinction matters. Leverage is designed to be visible and to be relaxed if the other side moves. Options are designed to be usable at a moment's notice. What is in the Gulf right now is options. So while I acknowledge the Steelman, my read of the evidence is that we are in a different structural moment, and that the pattern matching to previous surges misses what has changed underneath. Let me now turn to the consequences, because the question you should be asking is not just what happens if this ends in kinetic action. The question is what happens even if it does not. Even in the scenario where no shot is fired, the dual chokepoint lock is already reshaping the Persian Gulf in ways that will not be reversed. Consider oil markets first. Brent crude has been trading in a range that reflects a persistent geopolitical risk premium, and every incident in the Gulf, every seizure, every reported harassment, adds a few dollars to that premium. If the enforcement architecture holds and Iranian exports continue to compress, you will see a structural tightening of the global oil market at exactly the moment when OPEC plus spare capacity is thinner than the official numbers suggest. When American shale production growth has plateaued below the trajectory that many analysts assumed in 2022, and when Chinese demand, while softer than it was, is still growing. That tightening will show up in your fuel costs, in your airline ticket prices, in the input cost for petrochemicals, plastics, and fertilizers, and eventually in food prices in emerging markets. This is not speculation. This is what happened in every prior episode of Gulf tension, and the current architecture is more sustained than any prior episode. Consider global shipping second. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz have climbed significantly. War risk surcharges that used to be measured in fractions of a percent of hull value are now measured in whole percentage points, and for certain flag states and certain cargo profiles, coverage is simply unavailable. That cost is passed through to the freight rate, which is passed through to the delivered price of crude refined products, LNG, and every dry bulk commodity that transits the region. Consider the LNG market third. Qatar accounts for roughly 20% of global LNG supply, and every cargo it exports transits Hormuz. Europe, which spent the last 3 years replacing Russian pipeline gas with LNG imports, is now structurally dependent on Qatari flows in a way it was not in 2021. Any serious disruption in Hormuz would produce a European gas crisis that would dwarf the 2022 episode because there is no strategic reserve equivalent in LNG that can absorb the shock. That is a vulnerability that European policymakers are only now beginning to talk about publicly, and it is a vulnerability that Tehran understands and that Moscow in the background appreciates. Consider Iranian domestic stability fourth. The Islamic Republic is not on the verge of collapse, and I want to be careful not to overstate this, because predictions of imminent Iranian collapse have been made many times and have always been wrong. But the regime is under a compounding set of stresses that it has not faced in this combination before. The economy is compressing. The proxy network is degraded. The nuclear program is damaged. The succession question around the supreme leader is open, and the internal factional struggle between the pragmatists around Pezeshkian and the hardliners around the IRGC and the security establishment is sharpening. In that environment, the temptation for the regime to manufacture an external crisis to consolidate domestic support is high. But the space to do so without triggering the American response that has been prepared is very small. That is a dangerous combination, because a regime that feels it must act but cannot act safely is a regime that may miscalculate. Consider the strategic shape of the Gulf Fifth. What the dual chokepoint lock is producing, whether or not any negotiation happens, is a normalization of intensive American maritime enforcement as the operating baseline of the Persian Gulf. That is a change from the previous baseline, which was periodic presence with implicit deterrence. The new baseline is continuous presence with explicit enforcement. Once that new baseline is established, it becomes very difficult to walk back because the Gulf Arab states now expect it, the shipping industry now prices it in, and any American administration that tried to reduce presence would be accused of abandoning the region. So even a negotiated deal with Iran, if one is achieved, would likely be implemented on top of this new baseline, not by dismantling it. Now let me address the question that I know is in your mind, which is whether this ends in war. I am going to give you my honest reading, and I want you to understand that I am giving you probabilities, not certainties. Because anyone who tells you they know for certain what is going to happen in the Persian Gulf in the next 12 months is either lying to you or lying to themselves. My reading is that the probability of a large-scale, sustained American military campaign against Iran remains low, perhaps in the range of 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, because both sides have strong incentives to avoid it, and because the domestic political constraints in the United States against another long Middle East war remain substantial. But the probability of a limited kinetic exchange, a set of strikes on Iranian naval or missile assets in response to some triggering incident, followed by an Iranian response that is calibrated to save face but not to escalate, is meaningfully higher, perhaps 1 in 3. And the probability that the current architecture produces a slow strangulation of the Iranian economy that forces Tehran either to a deal on American terms or to an internal political rupture is, in my reading, the highest of the 3 scenarios, perhaps close to 1 in 2. In other words, the most likely outcome is not war and not peace, but pressure, sustained, structural, architectural pressure that reshapes the region without a single decisive event. That is the scenario that mainstream coverage is worst at describing because it does not fit the news cycle. There is no explosion. There is no diplomatic breakthrough. There is just the steady turning of a screw. And Iran, 12 months from now, will be a substantially weaker regional power than Iran today, whether or not a shot is fired. Let me close with what this means for you, because I do not want to leave you with an abstraction. If you are watching global markets, you should assume that oil price volatility remains elevated for the foreseeable future, and you should assume that any incident in the Gulf, even a small one, will produce disproportionate price movement, because the market is now pricing tail risk that it was not pricing 2 years ago. If you are watching global politics, you should understand that what happens in the Strait of Hormuz over the next 12 months will do more to shape the credibility of American power in the Indo-Pacific than anything that happens around Taiwan, because Beijing is watching how Washington handles Iran as a signal of what Washington is willing to do elsewhere. If you are watching the energy transition, you should understand that the geopolitical risk premium on hydrocarbons is not going away, and that the case for accelerating energy diversification, whether through renewables, through nuclear, or through domestic production, is being reinforced by every tanker that gets seized in the Gulf of Oman. And if you are simply trying to understand the world you are living in, I want you to hold on to this, What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not a story about Iran. It is a story about the reconstruction of American maritime power in a region that Washington had, for 2 decades, half abandoned. It is a story about whether great power competition in the 21st century will be shaped by presence or by absence. And it is a story about whether the country that built the post-1945 order still has the capacity and the will to enforce the choke points on which that order depends. The answer to that question is being written right now in the waters between Bandar Abbas and Musandam, by ships whose captains understand that they are not just sailors on a rotation but instruments of a strategy that has finally, after a long period of drift, been reassembled. I have shown you the architecture, I have shown you the incentives, I have shown you the counter-argument and told you why I remain unpersuaded by it. What you do with that picture is up to you. But do not, when the next incident happens and the headlines light up, tell yourself that you did not see it coming. You saw it coming today, and you saw it coming because you followed the logic of power, the logic of geography, the logic of money, all the way down to the water.